What would you do if the last $2 in your pocket bought you a dead man's roof and nothing else? No bed, no promise, no welcome, only a door with a hole in it and a name the town would not speak above a whisper. This is the story of Charlotte Mercer, 21 years old, cast out with nothing but a canvas bag and a bruised jaw, who paid $2 for a bandit's abandoned hideout on the ragged edge of Dry Creek and walked in expecting only shelter. But what she found beneath its floorboards would drag her straight into the trouble the outlaw had died trying to outrun. Settle in with us. Let us know where you're watching from tonight, and stay close because the door has not yet opened. The wagon that carried Charlotte into Dry Creek did not stop for her. It slowed, and the driver jerked his chin at the road, and she stepped down into dust that rose to her knees. She did not thank him. He did not look back. The wheels rolled on and left her standing at the mouth of a town that seemed to have been assembled out of whatever the wind had not yet taken. A plank saloon leaning south, a livery with one door on its hinge, a church whose bell tower had gone empty long ago. Late afternoon, the sun sat low and copper over the ridges, and the shadows of the buildings reached toward her like tired hands. She was 21, thin from a week of skipped meals, and the coat on her back had belonged to her father before the fever took him. Under her left eye, a bruise the color of a plum was fading to yellow at its edges. 2 days back, in a farmhouse she had once called home, her stepbrother had told her to be gone by morning, and her stepmother had watched from the kitchen without a word. The land, the deed said, had never truly been hers. She had left with the canvas bag, a knife, a folded letter of her mother's, and $2 pressed into her palm by a neighbor woman who would not meet her eyes. Charlotte crossed the road and stepped up onto the boards outside the saloon. Music, thin and out of tune, spilled from within. A man leaning on the rail looked her over once and looked away. She did not ask. She walked past him toward the small clapboard office at the end of the street, where a hand-lettered sign read, "Land and titles in paint gone gray." The door stood half open. Inside, a clerk with ink on his sleeves was closing a ledger for the day. "I need a place," Charlotte said. The clerk lifted his eyes. "Nothing here for $2, miss." "Then show me what's for $1." He studied her a moment. Then he studied the coins she set on his counter. $2, warm from her hand. He drew a slow breath and reached, without looking, for a lower drawer. Outside, the wind lifted the dust in a long, slow curl down the length of the empty street, and somewhere at the far edge of town, past the last leaning fence, a coyote called once and did not call again. Charlotte waited. She had learned to wait. The clerk laid a single yellowed paper on the counter between them and turned it so she could read. His finger tapped the top line, then the price at the bottom, then the small map inked in the corner. He did not smile. He did not soften. What he said next was the closest thing to kindness she had heard in a week. $2, miss, but you ought to know whose it was." The paper was a deed. The property named on it was a one-room cabin 2 miles north of Dry Creek, set back against a stand of pine at the base of a low ridge. Its acreage was nothing to speak of. Its outbuildings were listed as 1 shed, condition poor, and 1 well, condition unknown. Its last recorded owner was a man named Roy Halloran, and beside his name someone had written, in a different hand, the word deceased. Charlotte read the name and read it again. She had heard it, though not often, and always the way frightened people say a thing they hope will not turn and look at them. Halloran had ridden with a crew that had robbed a stage line east of the mountains, and Halloran, so the story went, had been shot from his horse a season past and dumped in an unmarked grave in his hideout left to the weather. No one had claimed it. No one had wanted to. $2, she said. $2, the clerk agreed. Nobody's touched it. Some say nobody should. Charlotte pushed the coins across the counter. The clerk did not stop her. He wrote her name in the ledger, Charlotte Mercer, in a careful, even hand, and stamped the deed and folded it and slid it back to her without ceremony. "There's a lantern in the shed," he said. Or was. "And miss," he hesitated, "bar the door at night." She tucked the deed inside her coat, next to her mother's letter, and stepped back out into a street that had grown quieter while she was inside. 2 men on the saloon porch were watching her now, and one of them laughed low into his beer, and the other shook his head as though he had seen a fool bury her own coin. Word travels a small town before the buyer has crossed the road. By the time Charlotte reached the livery to ask the way north, 3 more men and a woman on a bench outside the mercantile had already heard what the girl from nowhere had done with her last $2. Would you have handed those coins across the counter, knowing whose walls they bought? Would you have walked 2 miles north at dusk toward a dead man's roof, alone? And what do you suppose Roy Halloran left behind, beneath boards no honest hand had lifted in a year? If this story pulls at you already, tell us in the comments where you're listening from tonight, and go on and subscribe, so you can walk the rest of this road with us. Because Charlotte Mercer is about to turn her back on Dry Creek and start walking. And what waits for her at the end of that road is not what the town believes it is. The liveryman was older than the town itself, thin as a fence rail, and he did not laugh when Charlotte asked the way. He only looked at her a long moment, chewed something behind his teeth, and pointed north with 2 fingers. "Follow the wagon rut," he said. "Past the second creek bed. You'll see the pines." She thanked him. He watched her go without answering. Behind her, the whispering had already started. She could hear it the way a person hears weather coming. Not the words themselves, but the shape of them, low and pleased and unkind. The woman on the mercantile bench leaned toward the man beside her and said something into her sleeve. He barked out a single dry laugh. A boy in a too large hat trotted past on some errand and stopped dead when he saw her, then ran on grinning as though he had a story to tell his mother. She kept walking. She had learned in the last week to walk through laughter, the way a person walks through cold rain. Near the end of the street, a heavy man in a good black coat stepped down off the boardwalk in front of her. He was broad through the shoulders, clean-shaven, with a silver watch chain across a belly that had never missed a supper. Charlotte did not know his name yet, but she would learn it before the week was out. Hollis Barrow, who owned the freight yard and half the notes in Dry Creek, and considered the rest of it his by right of patience. "You the one bought Halloran's shack," he said. It was not a question. "I did." He looked her up and down without hurry, taking in the coat too large for her, the bruise gone yellow, the canvas bag. His mouth moved in a way that was not quite a smile. $2, he said. "That's about what it's worth to bury a body in. You planning to bury yourself out there, girl? Or you planning to freeze first?" Charlotte did not answer. She had learned that too. "I'll give you 3, Hollis said. "Right now. Walk you back to the office, put my name on that paper, and you take the coach south in the morning. Save yourself a walk in the wrong direction." He waited. When she still did not speak, he leaned closer, and the smell of him was tobacco and pomade and something sweeter underneath. "That ground's mine soon enough. Everything north of the creek is going to be mine. You'd be doing yourself a kindness." "I've got a deed," Charlotte said. "You've got a piece of paper," Hollis said. And now he did smile, wide and without warmth. "Paper burns, miss." He stepped back and touched the brim of his hat, as if he had done her a courtesy. 2 miles north. Don't say the town didn't warn you." He walked back up onto the boardwalk and into the saloon, and 2 men on the porch tipped their hats to him as he passed. Charlotte adjusted the strap of the canvas bag on her shoulder and went on. She was almost past the last building, a low, sod-roofed place that might once have been a smithy, when a voice spoke from the shadow of its doorway. "Girl." She stopped. An old woman stood there, so small and so still Charlotte had not seen her at first. Her hair was white and braided over one shoulder. Her eyes were pale as river ice. She held a tin cup in both hands, the way a person holds a candle in a wind. "He hid more than he stole," the old woman said. "Mind the second board from the hearth." Charlotte opened her mouth. The old woman had already turned back into the dark of the doorway, as if she had spoken to no one. There was no sound of a chair, no footstep, only the soft settling of a hanging blanket in the frame. Charlotte stood a moment longer in the road. Then she pulled her father's coat tighter around her shoulders and walked out of Dry Creek toward the pines. The wagon rut carried her north through low grass gone the color of pale copper. The sun was on the ridge behind her now, and her own shadow ran ahead of her, long and thin and stooped as an older woman's. She crossed the first creek bed, which was dry stones and one puddle the size of a hat. A hawk turned once against the fading sky and drifted west. She kept walking. The second creek bed lay in a shallow fold of ground, wetter than the first. With a bar of mud she went around instead of through. Past it, the land lifted a little, and the pines came into sight all at once. A dark, irregular line at the base of the ridge, thicker than she had pictured. She had thought a stand of pine meant a handful of trees. This was a small, held breath of forest, close and quiet, with a smell of resin drifting off it in the cooling air. The cabin sat inside the trees like something the woods had grown around and half forgotten. It was smaller than the shed at her stepfather's place had been. A single room with a shake roof, one crooked chimney of river stone, one door of split planks, one window shuttered from inside. The shed leaned behind it at an angle a person could measure with a fingertip. Beyond both, the round, dark cap of a well, its rope gone. Charlotte stood at the edge of the clearing and looked at what $2 silver had bought her. The disappointment was a quiet thing. She had not let herself hope for much. Still, the smallness of the place, and the sagging shed, and the missing rope on the well, these settled into her chest one after another like coins into an empty tin. She thought of the men on the saloon porch, and the smile on Hollis Barrow's face, and she felt for a moment as if the whole town were standing behind her, watching her see it. She made herself walk to the door. The latch was a wooden peg, worn smooth. It lifted without protest. The door swung inward on hinges that gave one soft complaint, and the smell that came out of the dark was old ash, mouse, wool, and something faint and sharper underneath. Gun oil, maybe, or lamp oil gone rancid. Nothing living stirred. Charlotte did not go in. Not yet. She sat down instead on the flat stone that served as a step and set the canvas bag beside her. She ate the last strip of dried meat from the bag slowly, chewing each piece until it was gone. She drank a swallow of water from her flask. The pines above her were very still. Somewhere a long way off, a coyote spoke to another coyote and got no answer. She slept that first night on the stone step, with her back against the closed door, the knife unfolded in her lap and her father's coat pulled up under her chin. Twice she woke to sounds she could not name. A creak from inside the cabin, a soft settling as though something heavy had shifted in its sleep. And each time she listened until the woods went quiet again, and then she closed her eyes and waited for the gray of morning to come and tell her what she had bought. Morning came thin and gray through the pines. Charlotte woke stiff, the knife still open across her thighs, her breath clouding in front of her face. She stood, stamped, feeling back into her feet, and turned to face the door she had not yet been brave enough to walk through. In daylight, the cabin looked smaller, and also somehow more solid than it had the night before, as if it had settled deeper into the earth to wait for her. She pushed the door wide and let the light do the work of stepping in first. The single room held a rope bed frame with no rope, a plank table with one leg propped on a flat stone, a three-legged stool, and a cold hearth of the same river rock that made the chimney. A tin plate sat on the table. A blackened kettle hung on the hook in the fireplace. Charlotte stood in the doorway a long while before she crossed the threshold, and when she did, she crossed it slow, the way a person crosses ice. Nothing gave. The floor was rough plank, hammered down with square-headed nails, and it took her weight without complaint. She went first to the shutter and unlatched it. Light came in through the small square window and picked out dust the way lantern smoke picks out air. In that new light, she saw the room for what it was, swept once, some time back, by hands that had cared enough to sweep. The corners were clean. A broom of stiff grass leaned behind the door. Somebody had lived here and meant to come back. Charlotte set the canvas bag on the table. She walked the four walls slowly, running her fingertips along the logs, feeling the chinking. She looked up at the beams, and then she saw it. Above the hearth, on the underside of the heavy lintel beam, someone had carved a small mark. Not a name, not initials. A single crossed line inside a circle, no bigger than a coin, cut deep into the wood and rubbed dark with what looked like soot. Charlotte tilted her head to see it plainly. It had been carved to be found by a person who knew to look up and knew where to look. From the doorway, you would never see it. From the stool, you would never see it. Only standing directly in front of the fire, close enough to burn, could you lift your eyes and meet that mark. She thought of the old woman in the sod-roofed doorway. He hid more than he stole. Mind the second board from the hearth. Charlotte lowered her eyes to the floor. She counted from the stone lip of the hearth outward. First board, second board. The second board looked no different than the others. Same width, same nails, same weathered color. She knelt and pressed a palm flat against it. It gave nothing. She pressed harder. Still nothing. She sat back on her heels and stared at it. She did not pry it up. Not yet. She was too tired and too hungry and too aware that whatever a dead bandit had hidden was something a living man like Hollis Barrow might come looking for. She stood instead and stepped back from the hearth, and she felt her heart beating in her throat, the way it had beat 2 days ago in the farmhouse kitchen, while her stepbrother told her to leave by morning. Outside, a branch cracked. Charlotte's hand went to the knife at her belt. She stepped to the door and stood listening. The pines gave her back nothing but wind, but somewhere in that wind, closer than it ought to have been, she heard the soft, careful breathing of something alive. She stayed by the door a long minute before she stepped out. 20 paces from the cabin, at the edge of the pines, an old dog sat watching her. He was lean along the ribs, gray around the muzzle, with one ear folded and a pale scar running from his jaw down into the fur of his chest. He did not growl. He did not wag. He only sat as though he had been sitting there some while, and had decided she was worth the sitting. Charlotte did not move toward him. She said, "You belong here." It was not a question. The dog blinked once and stayed where he was. She went back inside and got the tin plate from the table and poured into it the last swallow of water from her flask. She carried it out and set it halfway between the cabin and where the dog sat. And then she walked to the shed instead and busied her hands there so as not to shame him with watching. When she looked again, the plate was empty, and the dog had moved 5 paces closer and lay now with his chin on his forepaws. The shed leaned but did not fall. Inside she found what the clerk had promised: a lantern, its glass sooted but whole, and beside it a tin of coal oil half full. She found also a coil of hemp rope that would fit the well, a mattock with a good haft, a shovel with a split handle mended in copper wire, and hung on a nail, a bridle without a horse. She stood a while looking at the bridle. The leather was oiled. Someone had cared for it recently enough that the oil had not gone hard. That first morning she carried the rope to the well and hitched it to the iron ring on the cap. She pried the cap up with the mattock and lowered the bucket she found dented but sound at the well's foot. The rope ran, and then went slack, and she drew up water that came clear after the third pull. She drank from her cupped palm, and it was cold enough to hurt her teeth. The dog stood now at the corner of the cabin, watching her drink. She filled the bucket a second time and set it near him and walked away. By midday she had swept the cabin twice, beaten the dust from the tick mattress she found rolled beneath the bed frame, hung her father's coat on the peg by the door, and laid a small fire in the hearth from kindling stacked already in a nook beside it. Someone had left that kindling dry and split. Someone had meant to come back and light it. She noticed things as she worked. The plank table's short leg was propped on a stone, yes, but the stone was cut square on its bottom face. Cut, not found. The 3-legged stool's seat was smoother in one place than in the others, worn by the same shape of hand, over and over. Behind the broom, in the chinking between 2 logs, a scrap of red wool had been pushed in deliberate as a marker. On the underside of the bed frame, when she lifted it to shake it out, she found 3 shallow notches cut into the pine. 1, then 2, then 3. The way a man counts days. Her hands were learning the cabin before her mind could name what it was learning. Each small thing she righted or cleaned gave up another small thing that did not fit. Halloran had not lived here like a man passing through. He had lived here like a man building something and expecting to finish it. Late in the afternoon, she carried the mended shovel to the far side of the shed and turned a strip of earth for a garden she could not yet plant. The dog followed her at 10 paces, sat when she stopped, rose when she moved. She did not speak to him again. She did not need to. When the sun leaned toward the ridge, she went back inside and knelt once more at the hearth and set her hand on the second board and felt, this time, that it was warmer than the boards on either side of it, as though something beneath it were holding the day's small heat and refusing to let it go. Charlotte sat back on her heels and looked at the board a long time before she moved. Outside, the light in the pines had gone the color of weak tea. She rose, fetched the mattock from where she had leaned it beside the door, and returned to the hearth. She did not hurry. She wedged the flat edge of the mattock into the seam between the second board and the third, and leaned her weight against the haft. The wood gave with a soft complaint, as if it had been waiting to be asked. The board came up in one piece. Beneath it, set into a hollow lined with river stones, lay a strong box of oiled canvas wrapped around something square. Charlotte lifted it out with both hands. It was heavier than it looked. She carried it to the table, unrolled the canvas, and light from the small window fell across it in strips. First a leather satchel, cracked at the corners, tied with a length of rawhide. Then, beneath the satchel, a tin box the size of a Bible, its lid stamped with the same crossed line inside a circle she had seen cut into the lintel beam. Then, beneath the tin box, a folded oilcloth bundle that clinked softly when she set it down. She untied the satchel first. Inside was a ledger bound in plain black cloth, its pages filled edge to edge in a slanted hand that pressed hard on the downstrokes. Dates, names, sums beside the names. She turned pages slowly. Half the entries were struck through with a single clean line. Beside 3 of them, small notes had been written in the margin. Paid back, paid back, paid back, in the same slanting hand. The tin box held letters, 12 of them, tied in twine. The topmost was addressed to a woman in a town Charlotte did not know, and the ink on the address had been smeared once and rewritten. She did not open the letters. It felt wrong to open the letters before she understood the ledger. The oilcloth bundle held money, not a fortune. Enough. Federal notes folded into thirds, and beneath them a small linen pouch of gold coin, and beneath the pouch a folded page torn from a larger book, on which had been drawn a rough map with the ridge behind the cabin at its top, and a black cross set into a bend of the creek. Charlotte laid each thing flat on the table and stood looking down at all of it in the dwindling light. The ledger was a record of debts owed, not by Halloran, but to the people whose names he had written down. He had been paying them back. Some he had already paid, some he had not. The names struck through were the ones already made whole. The names still open were the ones he had died before reaching. At the bottom of the last written page, in the same pressed hard hand, one line stood alone. If I do not finish this, let someone finish it. Charlotte set her palm on the page and did not move for a long time. The dog had come as far as the doorway and lay across the sill with his chin on his paws. She did not tell him to leave. She wrapped the money back into its oilcloth, retied the letters, closed the ledger, and set everything into the canvas again except the map, which she folded once and slid into the coat inside pocket, next to her mother's letter and the deed. Then she set the board back where it had been and pressed it flat with her boot until the seam disappeared. She sat at the table with her hands folded on the black cloth of the ledger and understood, without being told, that she had bought more than a roof for $2 silver. She had bought a debt somebody had begun to repay. That night, she barred the door with a plank the clerk had not mentioned and slept for the first time inside the walls. The dog slept across the doorway from the inside. She had not invited him, and she had not refused him. 3 days passed in that manner. Charlotte drew water in the mornings, worked the garden strip after breakfast, cooked what little she had at midday over a small fire, and in the evenings sat with the ledger by lantern light and read the names one at a time until she could recite them. She did not yet know how she would find the people whose names were still open. She only knew that she would. On the 4th night, the wind changed. It came down off the ridge with a smell of rain in it and set the pines moving. The dog lifted his head from the sill an hour before Charlotte heard anything. She rose from the stool, put out the lantern, and stood in the dark, listening. Hooves. 2 horses moving slow through the trees. Then a third, following. Charlotte took the knife from the table and went to the shuttered window. Through the gap in the shutter, she saw 3 riders enter the clearing at a walk, and behind them, walking on foot with his hand on the neck of the 3rd horse, a boy of maybe 10 in a torn shirt, barefoot, holding his elbow tight against his side. The lead rider was not Hollis Barrow. He was thinner, with a rifle across his saddle and a red kerchief pulled to his throat. He called toward the cabin without dismounting. "House," he said. "We know you're in there." Charlotte did not answer. The dog rose to a crouch and made no sound. "Halloran had a book," the man said. "You give us the book, we ride." Behind him the boy stumbled and went to one knee in the dirt. The second rider reached down and cuffed him upright by the collar without looking. The boy did not cry out. He had learned, as Charlotte had learned, to move through pain quietly. Something in Charlotte settled then, cold and clear as well water on the third pull. She could push the ledger through the door, and they would ride. And the names still open in it would stay open forever. Or she could not. She unbarred the door and opened it a hand's width. "Send the boy in first," she said. The lead rider laughed once, short. "He ain't for trade." "Send him in," Charlotte said, "or ride out and come back with more men. There isn't a book in this cabin that any of you can read." The riders looked at one another. The lead man spat sideways. Then, because a girl alone was not worth a bullet before he had seen inside, he jerked his head at the second rider, who shoved the boy forward across the dirt. The boy came at a limping run. Charlotte opened the door just wide enough, caught his good arm, pulled him inside, and threw the bar down behind him. The rain began then, all at once, the way frontier rain does. It came down on the shake roof like a hand laid flat. Outside, the lead rider swore, and Charlotte heard the wet click of a hammer drawn back in the dark. Charlotte pushed the boy behind the table and told him to lie flat. He obeyed without speaking. She took the plank shovel from beside the door and set it against the shutter as a brace. Then she took the knife in her left hand and the mattock in her right and waited in the dark with the dog low at her feet. The lead rider called again through the rain. He said the book, and he said now. Charlotte moved to the shutter, cracked it a finger's width, and saw the second rider swinging down from his saddle with a length of pitch pine already lit under his coat. He meant to burn her out. She did not think. She pushed the shutter open, brought the mattock across, and threw it flat and hard. It struck the rider across the shoulder and knocked the torch from his hand into the wet grass, where it hissed and went dark. The dog came off the floor then, silent as the mattock had been, and cleared the doorway before Charlotte could call him back. He took the second rider at the wrist and bore him down into the mud. The lead rider raised his rifle. Before he could aim, hoofbeats came out of the trees behind him at a hard trot, and a lantern swung wide in the rain. 3 horses broke into the clearing. The livery man rode the first, thin as a rail and grim as weather. Behind him came the old clerk, with a shotgun laid across his saddle, and a broad woman Charlotte did not know with a coil of rope in her hand. They had seen 3 strange riders pass Dry Creek at dusk, and they had come north through the rain because a girl had bought Halloran's place for $2 silver. The lead rider looked once at the shotgun and once at the clearing, and he did not fire. He wheeled his horse and rode. The third rider went after him. The second rider, held by the dog and then by the liveryman's rope, sat in the mud and said nothing at all. By first light, the rain had stopped. The clerk sat at Charlotte's plank table with the black cloth ledger open in front of him, and read the names one at a time in the flat. Careful voice of a man who had spent a life reading names. When he finished, he closed the book gently and set his hand on the cover. "These are debts owed," he said. "Everyone." He looked at her. He was paying them back. "I know," Charlotte said. Word traveled the way word travels in a small country. By afternoon, a wagon came up the wagon rut with 2 sacks of flour and a jar of lard from the mercantile benchwoman, who had laughed. By evening, a widow from the Second Creek bed brought a hen in a basket and would not take coin for it. The boy's people, who lived 12 miles east, came for him on a mule at dusk, and his mother put her forehead against Charlotte's forehead and did not speak. Hollis Barrow rode out on the 3rd morning in his good black coat. He did not dismount. He looked at the mended shed, the drawn well, the turned garden strip, the dog at the door, and the smoke rising straight from the crooked chimney. He looked longest at Charlotte, at her yellowing bruise almost faded now, and at her father's coat, which fit her better than it had. "I misjudged the ground," he said. "You misjudged the deed," Charlotte answered. Hollis touched the brim of his hat, turned his horse, and went back down the rut toward Dry Creek at a walk. He did not come again. Through that spring and into the summer, Charlotte worked the open names in the ledger one at a time. She wrote letters in a slanting hand, not unlike Halloran's, and sent them out with the coach south and the freight north. Federal notes folded into thirds went to a widow in a mountain town Charlotte had never seen. Gold coin in a linen pouch went to a blacksmith who had lost a brother to a stage line robbery east of the mountains. Each name, when it was paid, she struck through with a single clean line, the way Halloran had done, and she wrote in the margin the same 3 words in her own hand. Paid back. The dog stayed. He grew no younger and no less watchful. He slept across the doorway from the inside every night of that summer, and the fold of his ear never lifted. The boy came back twice on his mother's mule, once to bring a jar of honey, and once only to sit on the flat stone step and eat bread with Charlotte and say nothing, which was, between them, the shape their friendship had taken. Late in the season, on an evening when the sun leaned gold across the ridge and the pines threw long, patient shadows into the clearing, Charlotte drew the last bucket of the day and set it on the well cap. The clerk had ridden up on his gray mare to bring her a letter from a woman in a town Charlotte still did not know, the widow whose name had been the last open name in the book. The letter thanked her for a debt she had not owed. The clerk did not read it. He only put it into her hand and looked at the cabin, the shed, the garden heavy now with squash and beans, the dog, the smoke, and the girl. "You've made something here," he said. Charlotte looked at the ridge, at the pines, at the low, warm light on the shake roof she had slept under her first frightened night. She thought of 2 silver dollars pushed across a counter, of a plank door barred at dusk, of a name struck through in a slanting hand. "I didn't buy a cabin," she said. "I bought a promise somebody started keeping." The clerk nodded once, slow. He mounted his gray mare and rode back down the rut, and the sound of the hooves faded into the pines. And Charlotte stood a long while in the last of the light with the dog beside her and the letter in her hand. "Thank you for staying to the end of this one, friend. If Charlotte's slow, stubborn kind of hope stayed with you, leave a like. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and subscribe so the next quiet story can find you. Ride safe. Another cabin, another dust road, another hidden truth is waiting."